about. However, because I have got 10 minutes uninterrupted, which as a politician is always a wonderful thing, because I'm limited to 6 minutes in the council chamber, I wanted to talk to you about a number of different themes, running from revolutions to the judiciary to what makes Britain so brilliant. And there is a play on letters, which you'll notice as we go through. So I'm starting with the letter B, which is, well, wait for it, this is for business and Britishness, okay? And actually to start with about the theme of Britishness, about our revered legal system. So obviously following the Norman Conquest in 1066, that's when we first formed, as many of you will know, our judicial system in the UK, and one which actually many countries around the world have based their judicial systems on, and to this day still respected as probably one of the best judicial and fairest judicial systems in the world, and something that I think as British people we should be extremely proud of. Then we move on to our Parliament, one of the oldest and again strongest and most revered parliaments in the world, formed after the signing of the Magna Carta, of course, in 1215. And that's where the oldest laws and pieces of legislation that this country formed came from. And then in 1707, when the English Parliament became from the Parliament of England in 1215, following the Magna Carta, to the Parliament of Great Britain in 1707. So a little bit of a history tour, going back about 900 years for you. Then we move on to other things that make this country so looked up to and respected around the world, and that's our education system. And actually yesterday, because I was preparing to come and speak to you today, I googled the 10, and I know Google's not always accurate, but I think this one is on fairly safe ground here, that the 10 top universities in the world, 4 of them are British universities, and that's obviously Oxford and Cambridge, Imperial and UCL in London. And I think for a small nation, when you think about the percentage of people of the global population that live in this country, the fact that we have 4 out of the 10 top universities is pretty awesome, actually. And that means that we are educating some of the brightest and finest engineers, mathematicians, economists, lawyers around the world that are helping to have a really, really positive impact on people's lives. And then we move on to the NHS. And actually, to quote a lady who was talking from, I can't remember her name now, she was an economist from, I think she was actually an economist from Germany. And she was interviewed here last year as part of a World Health Summit. And she said that the NHS is ranked the best healthcare system in the world. Now that is in the entire world. And yes, there are places like Switzerland that are very good at certain things, but they're much smaller in what they do. And we have a very fair NHS. And I know that we get a lot of stick nationally, particularly some of our friends on opposite sides of the political spectrum to us. But actually, I think we should hold our heads very high that our NHS is outstanding and the people that work within it are absolutely second to none. And on that point, I think we should just give them a little clap to the NHS. So, B is for Britishness, it's for British standards, and it's for holding our heads high from the 30th of March onwards and forever for whatever might come. So I'm going to lay the B down here in front of us. The next letter is R. So you may see where I'm going with this. But I said revolution, and again I had to try and fit themes around certain letters, but actually it's about industrial revolution, and it's about Great Britain and why we have been so revered for hundreds of years. And that's because the Industrial Revolution, which started back in the mid-1700s, had people in cottage industries making things in their homes, and suddenly people had the idea to grow that, to do it beyond their own homes, to employ other people, to start using machinery. And that industrial revolution that then spanned the next 150 years and is still carrying on today, spread across all of Europe and then on to America as well. And actually I think Britain has played such a huge part in the capitalist society across the world. So it really is something else to be very proud of. in terms of industrial revolution and in terms of Britain making things and engineering, I'm sat next to a retired naval officer, so it would be remiss of me not to talk about the Navy and about some of the brilliant feats of engineering that have actually come out of this country. And we are very lucky, and you mentioned that I'm a trustee of the National Museum of the Royal Navy, and one of the museum offerings within the National Museum is the Warrior. And the Warrior, many of you will be able to see it across the harbour, a beautiful warship, or battleship actually. But one of the important things about the Warrior, as again most of you will know, is that it was the first ironclad steam-powered warship. So again, whilst it was only unique for a number of years, and then they changed to different ways of powering ships, and it became obsolete fairly quickly. The point is, at the time of its launch, it was cutting edge from an engineering perspective, and again, very much owes its heritage, its home to Portsmouth. And because of the Navy, we have always been at the cutting edge of maritime engineering advancement around the world. And you know, the Australians, for example, who have now brought the information technology, the designs behind the Type 26. So the most advanced frigates in the market at the moment, the Australians are now commissioned those, and BAE Systems are in the process with other British defence contractors to build those Type 26s for Australia. So I think we should be very, very pleased about that. And now talking about industrial revolutions of the modern age, so coming to the modern day, and we have our absolutely excellent, and someone I count as a friend actually, Greg Clark, who I think is an outstanding Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, a really fine man who was once a councillor himself, so very involved in local communities, local councils, rose up to become an MP, and obviously is now representing Britain on the global stage. And he carried through an industrial strategy consultation and has now made that part of the British government's policy. And that industrial strategy, which was adopted in January 2018, so just over a year ago, has 10 pillars of how Britain is going to start manufacturing things and making things again to make sure that our economy remains in the top 10 strongest economies in the world. And I'm going to leave there on the economics because I'm coming back to that one with the letter E subsequently. But actually, Greg was absolutely right, and I had the privilege to talk to him on several occasions about his department's industrial strategy. And it's only by manufacturing things again that we can make Britain globally competitive and safeguard for the long term. And at the moment, we're not able to do that for a number of reasons, and I will come back to that in a minute. So this is our park. So revolution was really industrial revolution. Okay. Then we move on to economy with E, economics plays a part in everything we do, whether it's as a councillor, if you're managing a portfolio of libraries or community centre budget, or whether or not you're running a government department such as Penny and Caroline being a minister in health. We all have our part to play as either residents who are voting in decision makers, but economics, you can't make decisions, you can't improve communities, you can't have a positive effect on people's lives from a government perspective unless you have the money to help them in some way. And actually economics is so important. So I'm going to give you a few stats. So apologies for looking down at this point. Since 1956, when specific GDP data started to be recorded, GDP growth in the UK has been growing on average by 2.45% per year. So probably not that unexpected to many of you. However, 10 years ago, this quarter, the beginning of 2009, so you'll remember the last period of governance under a Labour government, there was a record low GDP rate. I didn't say growth, rate. It was minus 6.1%. And that shows you the difference. We inherited this broken, this fractured economy in 2010, and one of the biggest deficits in the developed world, and in spite of that, we have had positive GDP growth every single year. The last quarter of 2018, the growth for that quarter in the UK and in GDP in the UK economy was 1.4%. The actual growth in the last quarter of 2018, in spite of Brexit, in spite of us voting to leave the European Union and the predicted global recession that was going to hit if we voted to leave, The UK economy grew by 1.5%. We actually outgrew the economist predictions. And I think that we should all hold our heads very, very high, because I think people in this country work incredibly hard, and I think that's in spite of the adversity that we've had, we've proved that we can still do it. Yesterday, as I was preparing this and doing some research on some of the stats, I was listening to the 10 o'clock news, and there was an economic revision for 2019 growth last night, and it's actually revised the growth predicted for this year again, even from the 30th of March afterwards, the day after we leave the European Union. This country's economy is predicted to not shrink or stand still, as other European economies are doing, but to actually grow in spite of all of the adversity, in spite of all of the uncertainty, to grow by 1.7%. And I think, considering everything that's stacked against us, that is outstanding. The deficit has almost gone. The Chancellor said in his budget in the autumn last year, austerity is at an end. And for those of us who are running councils, we are thinking, hurrah, we need a bit of reprieve, we need that, the police need that, we need to start seeing public spending going up in public services. For me, as leader of the opposition, you can imagine in Portsmouth, I thought, great, for the last 4 years I've had a decreasing budget every year, that I've been out of power now for 4 months and the Chancellor's brought austerity to an end. Thank you, I owe you, Mr Hammond. But anyway, listen, for the country, for the people of Portsmouth, for the people of Gosport, it's clearly the right thing to happen. In terms of the national debt that we have, so it's all very well and good living within your means, so you have, for example, £1 trillion a year coming in and you're spending £1 trillion a year. So we are now we're living within our means. Great. That's a hypothetical figure, by the way, so I appreciate this is going out online. So we're living within our means. But we still have this huge national debt that has been growing since the war. And actually, I was looking it up last night. We pay £5,120 interest per second on our national debt. So in the time that I've been speaking, we've already spent well over £1 million. And that is really quite staggering. So now we're living within our means, our economy is growing, there's more tax coming in, the country is becoming wealthier every single year. It's important that we do, yes, start spending more money on the police and prisons and the NHS, but we also need to start reducing that national debt, because if we don't, again, the structure of our economy will not remain as strong as it is now. And this also brings me on to talking about things such as work, pay and standards. Yes, it's important that people do have pay rises and that keeps up with particularly inflation, so that people aren't becoming poorer each year. But if we are to follow Greg Clark's dream, if we are to start becoming globally competitive on the manufacturing scale, we need to not outprice ourselves from the market, because it actually has a knock-on effect, because you send the jobs overseas to places like China, where it's far, far cheaper to make things. So we must start making ourselves globally competitive. And actually, ending on E for economy, we are the 5th largest economy in the world, in spite of the fact that we are one of the smallest populations in the top 10 economies, and I have every hope that we will remain where we are today. Moving on, now finding a word beginning with X to tie into a conservative political lunch club is not easy, so you'll have to bear with me. I've gone for exit as opposed to a word beginning with and I'm not illiterate, I do appreciate that starts with an E, but you'll have to bear with me on this one. We are going to be, as we know, £39 billion better off if we don't have a deal. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating no deal, and I don't really want to offend anyone in the room who may have voted Remain, because actually this isn't about whether you voted Remain or Leave. This is about having a positive outlook on what's coming, because it is coming, in spite of the pleas from certain people in the community to have second referendums, whether there is a delay to Article 50 being triggered, which the Prime Minister has ruled out, whether there is a prolonged period of the 2-year transition period. We don't know if that will happen. Let's see how the talks over the next 49 days go until we leave. But one thing the Prime Minister affirmed again last night after her talks in Brussels is we are leaving the European Union. So whatever your take is on this, I think the future for Britain, and I'm not saying it's going to be pain-free, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, because of course I'm not an economist and I can't make those kind of predictions, and even the economists who made those predictions previously got it wrong. But I do believe that hopefully, in what I've said to you so far, whilst a lot of it has been historical, it gives you a flavour that I believe that Britain can stand up on its own 2 feet and rise up, particularly in times of adversity. We heard previously, going back 19 years ago, what was going to happen when we went from 1999 to 2000, the millennium bug. People's lights were going to turn off, traffic lights wouldn't work, computers wouldn't switch on, people wouldn't be able to buy petrol, people were hoarding their petrol and all of the things that they were, dear to them in their lives. And actually, at midnight, and 1 minute past midnight, in the year 2000, everything just carried on as it had before. Now, I'm not naive enough to believe that everything is going to be the same as it was before, but I do think that we need to remember that the European Union actually need this deal as much, if not more, than we do. And I'm going to come back to some of this in a minute. We did hear that there would be a global recession and banking crisis and that interest rates would be skyrocketing. And actually, Mr. Osborne, love him or hate him, got it wrong. What he said wasn't the case. And actually, being editor of the Evening Standard, maybe that's the right place for him. But actually, we fought 2 world wars. We've had that Industrial Revolution, we've done it before, and I think we can do it again. So X is for exit. I'm almost there, as you can guess. I is for Italy. And the reason I picked Italy, as some of you probably won't be surprised, is because they're in a lot of strife, both economically and politically. They've had 2, I think it may be even 3 general elections in a 2-year period. They've had to change, ministers of different departments. They've had fallouts and riots and protests about whether or not to bring in an austerity programme or not. Their economy is absolutely fractured. It's fundamentally flawed. And actually, for the first time in decades, probably in most people's lifetime, they have elected a coalition government which has a very right-wing element to it. And what you can see now is there is a very interesting shift in politics across the developed world, and it is becoming more right-wing. And I think that is because people are starting to value different principles because they have, for example, for us here in this country, our Britishness, if people feel that is being threatened, they really don't like it. So Italy, an economy in recession. Germany, an economy just tipping over into recession. France, with their Yellow Vest movement and all of their protests on the streets. Actually, is there going to be an exit? Are we going to have an Italian exit? Is it true what the Polish Prime Minister said to Theresa May? We're watching what goes on with you because we might be following shortly after. Are these things going to happen? For the European Union, if they decide to stay as a group of 27 when we're not there, that is entirely up to them, and good luck to them if they do. I would love us to go back to something similar to the common market. I would love us to go back to how we had it in 1975. Where we were a sovereign country, we made our own decisions, about legislation and about health and work care rights for our own residents and citizens in this country, but we had that trading bloc and, more importantly, that stability amongst the member states of Europe. I think it's completely grown. It's a monster that grew 10 heads. And I think that the 5 unelected presidents of the European Union really did completely shoot themselves in the foot with just how bureaucratic and overburdensome the European Union became. But actually, there are some very good things within the European Union that I think is going to be a shame that we will be walking away from. But nonetheless, that's where we are. And maybe in the future, there will be revisions if there are other member states that leave that will get, force the European Union to look back and to maybe focus back on what initially brought them together 40 odd years ago. So that is my I is for Italy. And finally, the T is for trade. And as I said, for Great Britain starting to make things again. So it's really key that inflation is low. And we have had record low levels of inflation under this Conservative government for the best part of the last 10 years. I think it's really important for us here in the Solent area trade. We've got one of the busiest ports in Europe, in Southampton. We've got the largest municipal-owned port in Portsmouth. And actually bringing fruit and goods and cars and services across through these 2 ports is absolutely key. People that live in your area in Gosport clearly work in the 2 ports, or they work in a company that is dependent upon goods and parts coming in through the ports, or more importantly, they're making things that are going out through the ports, exporting, and that's really important. This morning I've been in a meeting and then in contact with the government about the port of Portsmouth and something to do with Dover, because they're a ro-ro port, a roll-on, roll-off port, the same as Portsmouth, and talking about how we are going to make sure we have the infrastructure in place with Hampshire Police, Hampshire Fire, QA, and all of the agency partners that we need on board for the 30th of March onwards, to make sure that actually trade is not affected beyond the period that it needs to. And for me, I think with trade, with exiting, with the economy, with all the things I've spoken about today, it's a bit like starting a new job. On day one, you do feel like you're a bit out of sorts. You don't know who you're sitting next to, or the colleague you're going to be working closely with. Within a month, things feel much more comfortable. Within 6 months, it feels like you've been there forever. And I do believe that we will hopefully quickly get to that point, and particularly as we have agreed 4 trade deals in the last 2 weeks alone. We haven't signed them yet because we're not allowed to, but they are agreed and ready to go. So actually I wish our party was pushing out some more of the really good news stories that are going on, and maybe they are, but the press, for whatever reason, are choosing not to publish some of the positive stuffs that are coming down the track. So on that final letter of T for trade, I'm going to stop and just say thank you so much for listening to me. I hope that we all can pull together, and wherever you are on the spectrum of leave or remain, I believe that Britain's future for the long term is a very bright one.